Welcome to the Black Liturgy, where forgotten truths are resurrected and history is stripped of its lies. It begins with the scent. You don't see it, you don't hear it, but it finds you. Damp, sweet, metallic, like breath trapped behind stone. A scent that should never exist above ground. And yet, in the autumn of 1838, anyone who came within 100 yards of the Hollingsworth property could taste it in their mouth. Like milk and blood. The two oldest secrets. Now listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you, you were never meant to hear. This isn't history. It's legacy, etched not in ink, but in rituals, in bloodlines, in the silence that echoes when a family vanishes and no one dares to ask why. The Hollingsworth name should have disappeared with the last breath of the eldest son, but it didn't, because some names are not erased. Some are buried, alive. You feel that? That pressure on your chest? That's not fear. That's the truth finally recognizing you. The Hollingsworths didn't just live in isolation. They curated it. A dynasty of silence, of milk, of blood, and of something else, something that slithers beneath the floorboards of American history, coiled and waiting. We speak of them now not to remember, but to unseal. You've just stepped into the first chamber, and what waits ahead will not let you leave unchanged. Elijah Hollingsworth, 1802, arrives with 3 sons and a Bible that had been burned at the corners, not by accident, but with intent. He built his house over a spring the locals refused to drink from, because even then, they knew. This was not land for sowing. It was land for seeding. And what he planted wasn't crops. It was control, not of people, but of something deeper, something old. The spring dried up within a year. But what came after wasn't water, it was vision. And those who drank from it reported dreams. Not dreams of the future, no, dreams of the before, of men who walked like beasts and children whose mouths were sewn shut. A revelation too heavy for the unchosen. Elijah warned them. Revelation, he said, is not for the curious. Only the hollow can hold it. What was he hollowing them for? Behind the house, a structure rose. Not a barn, not a chapel, no windows, no cross. Just a sealed door with one key. Only Elijah held it. And each Sunday, the boys went in, and they did not come out until the moon was high. No singing, no shouting, just silence, chewed silence. Silence with teeth. It is said his son Thomas once questioned what was inside. Elijah beat him bloody, then poured milk into his mouth and whispered, "Only what's holy can fill you again." That's not discipline. That's doctrine. That's the blueprint of control. Now stop. Think. Ask yourself, who taught you what holy means? You see, this isn't just a story about a strange family on a cursed ridge. This is a map of how they build bloodlines. Not for survival, but for preservation. Because once you understand that the most dangerous families don't die, they replicate. You stop asking, what happened to the Hollingsworths? And start asking, where are they now? But let's go deeper. Let's talk about the ritual, the candles. Hundreds of them. A perfect ring around the hearth. Each burned down to the wick. Each set with intention. Firelight is not just warmth, it is witness. And every flame that burned was marking something unseen. Marking presence. When they found the house empty in 1838, they found only wax, milk, and the smell of breath still clinging to the stone walls. No bodies, no blood, just imprint. Let me ask you something. What if death was never the point? What if disappearance is the ritual outcome? Understand this now. Rituals aren't about belief. They're about engineering. Psychological engineering. Institutional engineering. And the Hollingsworths didn't operate in chaos. They followed a pattern older than the county records. A system older than America itself. The mother. Always silent. Always watching. She died during the journey, they say. But there are sightings. A black veil. Clasped hands. Standing at the orchard's edge. Waiting. For what? For the birth. Clarabelle, the midwife. Called before dawn. Led by a barefoot boy holding a silver spoon. She delivered something. It didn't cry. It didn't scream. It pulsed. Wrapped in white. Laid in milk. And Clara burned her apron afterward. This wasn't a child. It was a continuation to do you feel it now? You're not listening to a horror story. You're standing at the edge of an orchard. And the trees are starting to hum. And that hum? That's not wind. That's invocation. They bent inward over time, those trees. Formed a ring around the clearing. Like witnesses. Or jailers. And at the center, always the building, the one without windows, built not for living, but for hosting. Who, or what, was inside? And if that doesn't disturb you, remember this. No one saw a Hollingsworth buried. Now pause. Listen, there is something I want from you. Not for entertainment, not for vanity, but to mark your passage into deeper knowing. If you've made it this far, you are no longer merely a viewer. You are now a carrier, a potential witness. So comment this phrase twice. Only what's hollow can be filled. Again, only what's hollow can be filled. Say it aloud as you type. And feel the shift. You're no longer outside the orchard. You're beneath it. Look around you, not your room. Not your screen. I mean truly look within. What if everything you believe about bloodlines, about family, about origin, isn't just incomplete, it's fabricated? Because where we come from determines what we allow, what we protect, what we silently pass on. And the Hollingsworths, they understood this. They understood that if you control the root, you never need to prune the tree. But here's the secret. The Hollingsworth family didn't begin with Elijah. He was not the first. He was the first allowed to emerge in public. The earliest records and local archives list Elijah's arrival in 1802, but further south, in old Georgian legal ledgers marked for destruction, there's mention of a Judah H. In 1774, property seizures, church expulsions, a note from a town bishop reads simply, "The boy sees through the altar." And then Judah vanishes from the record until 1837, when that same name reappears on a letter with no return address. Judah Hollingsworth. He remembers even what you forget. This is how legacy works. Not by blood alone, but by remembering what others are conditioned to forget. Now, let's return to the orchard. Because, while the townspeople whispered of curses and blasphemy, something more methodical was taking place. A transmission of memory through environment. The soil turned hostile to crops. Potatoes grew hollow. Corn spiraled unnaturally. And the cows, animals bred to nourish, began producing milk that spoiled within moments. But not for the Hollingsworths. Their bowls of milk remained warm, intact, ritualistic. Milk wasn't a drink in that house. It was a medium, a symbolic bridge between body and memory, between death and repetition. That you've heard the phrase, "Don't cry over spilled milk." But at Hollow's Reach, they prayed over it. Now picture this. Children in town begin humming unfamiliar tunes. Lines drawn in dirt. Circles etched into wood. Every night, a new mark appears on the trees at the orchard's edge. Symbols, not of this tongue. Bent crosses, eyes without lashes, spoons pointed downward. Every glyph etched not to be read, but to be obeyed. This was not the madness of isolation. This was the ritualization of control. And who are the easiest to mold? Children. The younger, the better. Blank slates. Empty vessels. You remember Abigail Dawn? The 7-year-old girl who vanished chasing a ribbon into the orchard? She was known for speaking to her dolls like a preacher to a flock. But after her disappearance, her mother heard humming beneath their floorboards. When the boards were lifted, nothing. Just the smell of warm milk and cold dirt. And later, a note, in Abigail's handwriting, "She's full now. You don't have to look anymore." Let that settle. Because if children can be filled, then what exactly is doing the filling? You must understand, the Hollingsworth family believed themselves to be more than human. Not in arrogance, but in design. They saw the human body not as a vessel of spirit, but as a receptacle for memory, for instruction, for obedience. This is why they built the windowless structure behind the house. This is why no songs were sung, no Bibles read aloud. That building wasn't for worship. It was for programming, like a dark cathedral of repetition, where every ritual wasn't to praise something, but to awaken something. And over decades, that something began to push through the trees. Joel Flint, the carpenter, saw it firsthand. A procession in the orchard, figures robed in linen, each carrying bowls, hands trembling. And when one turned to face him, he swore he saw his own eyes staring back. Let me tell you now what the history books will never print. There was no Hollingsworth curse. There was only the slow perfection of a system, a method of hollowing out the individual and inserting something else, something older, something that doesn't blink, that doesn't forget, that drinks milk not for nourishment, but for memory. Understand this. Institutions study this. Governments whisper about it. Elite bloodlines mimic it in different forms, through education systems, through religious conditioning, through generational trauma disguised as tradition. The Hollingsworths just didn't hide it, and that's why they had to vanish. Because the moment you no longer see your body as yours, the moment you allow someone else to program your memory, your habits, your name, you're not a man anymore. You're a vessel, and Hollow's reach was full of them. You know how power survives? Not through brute force, but through ritual reinforcement. Every symbol, every repeated phrase, every gesture done without thought. That's how control seeps in. And in that orchard, the rituals were perfected. Consider this, the building without windows, always locked from the outside. Why? Because what was inside needed to stay contained. And yet, they entered weekly.to feed it. No.to become it. You feel the pull now, don't you? That sensation in your spine? That is not discomfort. That's recognition. Because part of you already knows that you've seen this pattern before. In places dressed as homes, as churches, as schools. But they all operate the same way. Input, repetition, erasure of will, replication of doctrine. Elijah didn't invent the method. He inherited it, just like you're about to. The story they tell is that the family disappeared, but the truth, they finished what they started. The orchard didn't die. It closed, like a sealed chapter, a buried chamber. And yet, things still escape, spoons with no reflections, children humming in foreign tongues, candles that burn without flame. Every sign whispers the same truth. They are not gone. They are remembering. And the deeper we dig, the more we'll see that the Hollingsworth family was not isolated. They were a node. A ritual laboratory hidden in plain sight, funded by silence, protected by fear, and preserved by reverence. This isn't folklore. This is replication theory, and it didn't die with them. They taught it to others. Quietly, carefully, through symbols, through milk, through naming. That's why the boy who fetched Clara the midwife never spoke. That's why the note found in the chapel was written in Abigail's hand. That's why Joel Flint saw his own eyes in another man's face. Because they were no longer individuals. They were hosts. Now ask yourself this, and ask honestly. What have you accepted without question? What phrases live in your head that you never chose? What daily rituals do you perform that you did not design? Because what happened in Hollow's Reach wasn't just a horror, it was a blueprint. And it's still being built. In private schools, in reformatory camps, in foundations bearing forgotten names, in families that last longer than empires. Still think this is just about a haunted orchard? No, this is about you, and the hollow places inside you that you never dared examine. You've made it further than most. Why now? The ordinary world should feel thinner, fragile, like something you could tear through with your fingernail. That's the first symptom of awakening. You don't feel safe because you aren't. But not because something is hunting you, because something is watching what you become. Understand this. The Hollingsworths didn't vanish. They withdrew, like a hand pulling back beneath the surface, once the seed had been planted, because this was never about one family. It was about seeding systems, about burying structures in the soil of America that would bloom invisibly across time. What looks like madness in one century becomes institution in the next. You don't believe me? Look at any system of obedience, religious, academic, corporate, familial. Now trace it backwards. Look past the origin stories, past the philanthropic lies. You'll find symbols. You'll find rites. And if you know where to look, you'll find milk. Yes, milk. A symbol older than scripture, older than empire. Milk was the first fluid we were trained to need. And what do you think it becomes when it's not used to nourish, but to initiate? The Hollingsworths used it to mark what was full, or what had been filled. Remember what Clarabelle said, the midwife. Whatever I helped bring forth, it was already waiting. The child she delivered didn't cry. It pulsed, and it was placed in a basin of warm milk. Now stop. Ask yourself, what kind of child pulses? You see, we've been conditioned to associate childbirth with pain, with purity, with hope. But for the Hollingsworths, birth wasn't a beginning. It was a return. The vessel was just that, a temporary container. The memory, that was the eternal. Let me show you what that means. In the winter of 1836, Reverend Caldwell of St. Lee's Chapel followed small, barefoot tracks in the snow, tracks that led straight toward the Hollingsworth orchard, never breaking, never deviating. And then, they simply ended. No body. No trail. Just gone. Mid-stride. As if something lifted the child from the earth without touching the ground. You know what that is? It's not abduction, it's harvest. Because once a vessel is filled, it doesn't need to walk anymore. This is why the children hum. This is why their drawings shift into circles with intersecting lines. They're not expressing imagination. They're transmitting memory. And the adults? They vanish in pieces. First their speech, then their eyes, then their names. You remember the tinsmith, Adaby, who stumbled into the house. He saw a man by the hearth holding a swaddled bundle that twitched. As it hummed, when he tried to speak, there was no reply. But he heard something. Not language, not music, something older than ethered. He was found days later, barefoot, blind in one eye. Never spoke again. That's not trauma. That's override. Let me make this clear. What the Hollingsworths were practicing was not witchcraft. It wasn't Satanism. It wasn't religious at all. It was a form of psychological engineering. And like all advanced systems of control, it ran on repetition, sensory cues, symbolic nourishment, and isolation. Let's unpack that. Repetition. The bell Elijah rang every hour for the first 7 days after arrival. Not for the land, not for the boys, but for something listening. Sensory cues. Milk. Always milk. Its smell. Its texture. Its warmth. Like breath made liquid. Poured into mouths split by discipline. Used not for growth, but for consecration. Symbolic nourishment. The candles placed in ritual rings. The bowls laid out for the days of creation. The spoons, always silver, always reflective, except when they weren't. And isolation. No neighbors. No school. No labor. Just the family, the house, and the building without windows. You understand. This was a closed system, a living archive of how to erase the self and replace it with doctrine. They were building a lineage not of genetics, but of agreement. That's how the real dynasties survive, not by forcing belief, but by removing the question of belief entirely. When you drink the milk, when you hum the song, when you accept the symbol into your mouth or your bed or your name, you're not being convinced. You're being converted. And once you're converted, you don't need proof. You become the proof. That's what the Hollingsworths understood. That's what their orchard became, a site of replication. Each ritual like a seed. Each disappearance like a harvest. Each whisper like a blueprint passed from tongue to tongue. Even when the orchard bore no fruit, the branches sagged from weight, from presence. And don't forget, when that lightning storm set the ridge ablaze, the fire stopped at the border of their land, curved around it, left the gate intact. Why? Because the soil had been ritually bound. 7 bowls of milk. 7 days of creation. 7 footprints, always facing inward. You see, even fire obeys pattern. Even flame respects legacy. Ask yourself, what legacy is shaping you right now? What rituals have you absorbed unknowingly? The daily prayer you mutter before bed, even though you haven't believed in God in years. The national anthem you were forced to stand for as a boy, hand over your chest like a sacrifice. The ring you bought because it meant you belonged. These are not choices. These are implantations. And the Hollingsworths were simply one iteration. A microcosm of a system used everywhere, by governments, by churches, by families too old to name out loud. Because this isn't about the supernatural. This is about the supernatural. The engineering of belief beneath the surface of culture. A shadow system designed not to be seen, but to be felt. Milk in your throat. Humming in your sleep. Candles without fire. Let me tell you the secret you've always sensed. You were never meant to think for yourself. You were meant to repeat. And unless you hollow out the programming, unless you make yourself empty enough to see, then you will never be more than another silent mouth in the procession. Now is the time to choose. You've heard stories of haunted basements, cold rooms, child-sized handprints, forgotten toys half melted into the concrete. But this wasn't that. The Hollingsworth basement wasn't haunted. It was alive. And what lived down there wasn't a spirit, or a curse, or some Gothic figment of folklore. What lived there was function, purpose, process. This was the heart of their system. Let me walk you down, step by step. No stairs. That's the first thing. You didn't descend into the basement. You were lowered. By rope. In silence. No lanterns. No flame. Only the light of the opening above, which got smaller the deeper you went. The pulley was older than the house itself. carved symbols in the wood, not occult, not demonic, but mechanical. A language of function, like musical notation or circuit diagrams. Each stroke meant something. Lift, seal, turn, still. The drop? Exactly 23 feet. Why 23? Because in Hollingsworth doctrine, 23 was the age of remission, the number at which a vessel could no longer be claimed from the outside. Beyond that age, the doctrine said, only those born within may return. In other words, after 23, you can't be possessed. You have to be grown. That's why none of the parents came back. That's why no one over 23 was ever found. Now imagine. The floor dirt? No stone. No, the floor was smooth. Seamless. Cool to the touch. Like glass, but not reflective. It absorbed light. And it pulsed, barely. Not like a machine. Not like an animal. More like a memory breathing. In the exact center was a basin. Shallow. Wide. And always filled with milk. But not cow's milk. Not goats. Not human. Something else. And suspended above it, dangling from sinewed cords, were mouthpieces. 3 of them. All different sizes. Like masks with hollow tubes leading up into the ceiling. Here's what the records say. Once every 7 years, a child was chosen to descend. Always alone. Always blindfolded. They would kneel at the basin and drink. Not for sustenance. For memory. What kind of memory? The kind that doesn't belong to you. Because the Hollingsworths believed that memory wasn't stored in the brain, it was stored in milk. Every child who drank became a carrier. And with enough carriers, the doctrine could be preserved perfectly, forever. No misinterpretation. No distortion. No need for scripture. The body became the archive. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is what came after. The body would change. Subtly. Bone density would shift. The palate would widen. The voice would lose tone. They would stop, blinking, and they would never sleep again, not in the normal sense. Instead, at night, they would sit upright in bed and hum. One note, always the same, no matter what house they were in, no matter what town. Some reports say the hum was heard in 4 counties. Others claim it caused seizures in pets. But those who lived through it, who survived it, say the hum did something far worse. It made them remember things that hadn't happened yet. You want the truth? The basement wasn't a prison. It was a transmission center, not broadcasting outward, but inward, into the bodies, into the minds, into the unborn. Because this wasn't about control. It was about continuity. You see, the doctrine didn't care who you were or what you believed. It only cared that the carrier state continued, that the memory chain remained unbroken. And the milk? It wasn't just a medium. It was a binding agent, a liquid code carrying genetic, psychic, and mnemonic data from one vessel to the next. That's why no dust settled in the basement, because dust is decay. And nothing died in that room. Nothing was allowed to. Decay was forbidden. That room was immune to time. Even today, locals who try to break into the Hollingsworth ruins report something strange. Their watches stop. Their phones glitch. Audio recordings play back with new voices. Not louder, not clearer, but closer, whispering through the static, and sometimes humming the same note the children made in their sleep. You don't need to believe me. You can dismiss this as rural folklore or mass psychosis. But know this. In 1919, when the state sent a demolition crew to finally level the property, the machines wouldn't start. Axles broke. Blades snapped. The crew fled, all except one man. He wandered into the orchard, shirtless, eyes rolled back, humming. He was found 3 days later, sitting cross-legged in the basement. With milk pouring from his ears, they institutionalized him. But he kept humming until 1945. Then he stopped, not because he died, but because another voice had taken over. Are you starting to see the shape now? This was not a haunting. This was a system. Upgrade. And it's still running. You've made it this far. You've tasted the hum. You've stared into the basin. But now we speak of what was never written, never whispered outside the oldest chamber, not by the townspeople, not by the law, not even by the surviving bloodline. We speak of mouth-binding. A ritual that made the state burn archives, made physicians recant their reports, and made a generation of children forget how to scream. Let me be precise. Mouth-binding was not a form of discipline. It was not symbolic. It was not theatrical. It was functional modification. And it began at age 7.7 years old. the age when language and memory converge in the brain. The Hollingsworths believed that by that age, the child had developed too much self, too much I, too much ownership of thought, and the doctrine had no room for ego. The doctrine had no room for individuals, only vessels that they began with the mouth. Step 1. The softening. The child was given a series of herbal tonics over 7 days, roots, molds, oils that made the tissue inside the cheeks pliable, and more importantly, numb. They couldn't cry, couldn't bite, couldn't resist. The Hollingsworth matriarch would then whisper a single phrase into their ear. What you do not say cannot be taken. Then came step 2, the binding. A thread. Not rope, not cloth, not wire. A thread made from the hair of 6 mothers who had given up their names, each having renounced their birth titles, maiden lines, and children. That thread was soaked in the basin milk and run through the child's mouth like a shoelace, starting from one cheek, through the oral cavity, out the other side, knotted, sealed, dried into place, no incision, no blood, only silence. They would remain this way for 6 days. No food, only fluid through the nose. But that was the point, starvation of the self, because during this time, the mind didn't shut down. It didn't sleep. It listened. And what it heard, beneath the floor, behind the walls, in the milk, it would obey. Step 3. The infusion. At dawn on the 7th day, the child was placed into what the family called the echo chair. Imagine a wooden throne, built not to restrain but to receive, carved from a single tree that had never touched sunlight, its arms inlaid with hundreds of tiny grooves, each groove filled with dried saliva. Not human, not animal. The family kept no records of its source. Once seated, the child would be left alone, mouthbound, sensory deprived, saturated in milk vapor mist. And then, the humming began, not from above, not from around, but from inside the chair. It would begin to vibrate, slow, low, purposeful. Those who observed and survived described it like this. It was like my thoughts were being rewritten by something older than thought. After 1 hour, the thread was not removed, it disintegrated on its own, turned to ash and dissolved into the child's saliva, which they would swallow without protest. Their first words were never chosen by them, always dictated, and always the same. The mouth is not mine. The voice is not mine. I will only speak what remembers me. Why this mattered? The Hollingsworths believed the greatest threat to continuity wasn't violence, rebellion, or interference. It was individuality. Free thought. A mouth binding wasn't just a silencing tactic. It was a reprogramming, a reset. It ensured that the child would never speak before listening, would never act before receiving, would never exist without permission. In their theology, words were not tools. Words were contracts. And a mouth that spoke freely was a mouth that signed blindly. The children after the binding, you could always tell who had been through it. They never smiled. They breathed slower than others. Their speech came in measured, calculated pulses. They didn't answer questions. They responded with reflections that you'd ask. Where are your parents? They'd say, where were you before you asked? You'd ask, what happened here? They'd whisper, something that is still happening. And their eyes, flat, not lifeless, not possessed, just replaced. Replaced by something not quite human, but not quite inhuman either. Just patient, because once the ritual was complete, the child wasn't just a child anymore. They were a relay for memories, commands, doctrine, instructions from something far older than blood, and some of them, just a few, were chosen to carry more. They were called the re-speakers, the voices of those long dead, the ones who had been sealed, entombed, or swallowed by the system. And when they spoke, it wasn't prophecy. It was playback, unedited, undistorted, perfect recollection of memories that were never theirs. We'll speak more of them soon. But before we leave this section, I want to leave you with a question. If your voice was never your own, would you notice? Because in some parts of America, remote, silent, forgotten, the humming still lingers. And there are children today who answer questions with questions. Children who never cried when they were born. Children who hum in their sleep. And if you meet one, do not ask their name, because it's not their name anymore. It's the name of what lives behind them. This is where the story begins to fracture, not break, fracture, because from here on, we're no longer just dealing with twisted rites, broken families, or forgotten basements. We're dealing with something far more dangerous, continuity. A system designed to outlive bodies, a voice designed to survive death, a doctrine that doesn't die when you bury it. It relocates, and that relocation? It happened inside children. They called them re-speakers, but they weren't prophets. They weren't visionaries. They didn't see the future. They repeated the past, word for word, emotion for emotion, syllable for syllable, not learned, not memorized, replayed. Who were the re-speakers? After the ritual of mouth binding was completed, a small number of children were pulled aside. Not all of them, only a few. The selection wasn't based on birth order, physical health, or intelligence. It was based on echo density. That's what the Hollingsworths called it. Echo density, the weight of invisible resonance inside a child's breath. The more dense their breath, the more receivable they were. How was this measured? With the basin test, the child was told to exhale into the basin 3 times if the milk rippled in a counterclockwise spiral. Once, then again, then a 3rd time. The child was marked. They would become re-speakers. And once marked, there was no undoing it. The 13-minute law. You need to understand something critical here, that re-speakers were not always active. They lived like normal children most of the time, silent, still, obedient. But when the ritual was performed, the child would enter a chamber lined with skin-bound scripture, sit on the echo stone, and inhale the basin's mist until their breath slowed to 6 per minute. Then, without warning, the child would say, "I remember what I was not." And from that moment, a voice would emerge, but it was not the child's, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes ancient, sometimes barely older than the child themselves. The voice would speak for exactly 13 minutes, not 12, not 14.13. Because if the session exceeded 13 minutes, something happened, something no one dared speak aloud. But one word did survive in the ledger: unreturning. The child would not return to themselves. The voice would stay. The echo would not let go. And from that moment on, the child was permanently overwritten. Their body remained. Their name did not. They became a hollow, a permanent speaker, a walking archive. And these were the ones that needed to be sealed. What did they say? The voices that came through were not random. They came with intent. They delivered coordinates, warnings, instructions, confessions, sometimes in archaic dialects, sometimes in languages the children had never been taught. Ancient Greek, Proto-Latin, a variant of Old Saxon with syllables not found in any record. 1 Chilling transcript, recorded in 1832 by Dr. Lionel Greaves, documents a re-speaker named Elias, age 10. The red room is beneath the blue house. Not yet. The jaw still twitches. He waits for the 3rd crow, then he moves. That was all Elias said. Hours later, Greaves was found hanging in the archive chamber. Inside his pocket was a sketch of a house, painted entirely blue, and a note that read, "There is no jaw." But I still heard it click. Why did the Hollingsworths do this? Power. Maybe. But more than that, they believed that memory could be purified through detachment. They believed that if you separated voice from ego, from emotion, from ownership, you could hear the true pattern beneath history. They wanted voices without filters, memories without edits, pain without anesthesia. The re-speakers weren't accidents. They were conduits. They weren't haunted. They were hosting the doctrine. Of the 13th minute among the forbidden scrolls of the Hollingsworth Library, one page stands out: burnt edges, sealed in bone glue. Found beneath the stairwell in 1891. It reads, "The voice may dwell 13 minutes within flesh. If it stays longer, it ceases to be voice. It becomes anchor. And anchors do not float. Anchors do not float." Let that sink in, because that's what they feared. Not the speaking, not the listening, but the anchoring. The voice deciding it no longer wanted to be memory. It wanted to be present tense. And then, the disappearance in 1901. The last re-speaker was recorded in a local ledger. A girl named Morel. She was 9. Quiet. Ritual compliant. She entered the echo chamber on September 2nd. The voice emerged. It spoke for exactly 12 minutes and 59 seconds. Then Morel said one final phrase in a tone no one recognized: "I do not need to leave." And then silence. For 27 years, no new re-speakers. No new echoes. No new rituals. As If the system itself had shut down, or worse, completed its cycle. What do you do with a child who no longer speaks their own thoughts? What do you do when their voice is no longer theirs? What do you do when the echo never stops? You bury them, but not in soil, not in coffins, not in graves. You bury them in silence, in a place built not for death, but for the unbearable condition of never being alone in your own head again. This was the fate of the overwritten. This was the purpose of the Silence Vault, the origin of the vault constructed in 1811 by order of Augustus Hollingsworth III. The Silence Vault was hidden underneath the western grounds of the estate. Disguised as a water filtration system, it wasn't on any map, that it didn't appear in any family blueprint. The workers who built it were foreign, brought in from places with no written language, chosen specifically so they couldn't record what they saw. What they built was not a dungeon. It was a containment system, a sequence of rooms designed with one goal in mind: to separate the voice from the body when the body will not let go. Each cell was octagonal, made of a mixture of lime, chalk, salt, and an unknown black resin that absorbed sound. The walls were lined with scripture written in reversed Latin, text not meant to be read, only to be present. Every door was sealed with copper nails. No locks. Why? Because no one was meant to enter after the child was sealed inside. The moment the echo stayed past the 13th minute, the child was led below, calm, silent, often smiling, and then placed into their vault, and the door was shut behind them. Living tombs, here is where the horror sharpens. The children inside did not die. They didn't rot. They didn't scream. They spoke for hours, days, weeks, each voice layered over another, repeating fragments from centuries past. Some recited scripture. Others gave coordinates to places that don't exist on modern maps. A few simply cried, not for help, but for silence, because the horror wasn't just for the caretakers, it was for the children too. They weren't possessed, they were shared. The voice never left, but their original self remained trapped, awake, aware, unable to move their own lips. Some went mad in days. Others begged, with brief moments of lucidity, to be emptied. One note, scratched with fingernails into the resin wall, read, "I can hear her blinking. I can taste her dreams. She loves blood oranges. I don't." Another simply said, "I remember dying, but I didn't." Attempts to undo the echo between 1840 and 1870. A secret branch of the Hollingsworth family known as the Drainwrights attempted to reverse the condition. Their goal: extract the echo. They used everything from surgical trephination to acoustic resonance machines, alchemical brews to total sensory deprivation. Results? All failed. In one case, a child named Simon was placed into a rotating iron lung designed to shake the voice loose. Instead, it awakened two more voices within him, each speaking in contradiction. One recited prayers, the other whispered what the family had done to their own mothers. Simon had to be sealed deeper, beyond the vault, into the Red Hollow, a place we will speak of later. Not now. You're not ready for that place yet. The vault still breathes. The last official entry into the Silence Vault was in 1913. Caretaker notes record. I placed her gently into the chamber. She did not weep. She looked at me and said, "When your daughter is born, name her Ruth. I will teach her to count birds." The caretaker's wife gave birth 2 years later. A girl. They named her Ruth. By age 4, she could name 87 species of birds by call alone. She never learned to speak to humans, only to birds. They sang back. Somehow, she understood them. What's buried doesn't sleep. It waits. The Silence Vault was eventually sealed, not destroyed, not emptied, just sealed. Why? Because even in 2025, sound engineers who've analyzed the soil in that area detect subsonic frequencies, repeating every 13 minutes. Each signal different. Each voice still transmitting, still waiting. And here's the darkest part. If these children are still alive, they're no longer children. If they are dead, the voices survive them. And if the voices have survived this long, it means they were never memories to begin with. They were invitations. In every dynasty that traffics in shadows, there is always a record keeper. Not a librarian, not a historian, but a watcher. One who doesn't chronicle truth, but rather what must be buried deeper than the grave can reach. For the Hollingsworths, This burden belonged to the keeper of the hollow ledger, the leather-bound tome no thicker than a hymnal, but heavier than it had any right to be, because it didn't just contain names, that it contained resonance, that it contained destinies rewritten by a voice not their own. And when opened, under moonlight, with gloves made of calfskin soaked in ash and milk, the pages would whisper, not aloud, but into your spine. The ledger's construction, ink made from memory, the hollow ledger is unlike any book created by human hands. Its pages are not paper. They are pressed lambskin, stretched over 7 days and cured in silence, meaning not even the sound of breath was allowed near the process. The ink, a mixture of crushed blackberries, iron gall, powdered teeth, and something darker, family. Notes suggest the final ingredient was dream residue, scraped from the eyes of sleeping orphans at the Hollingsworth Sanatorium in 1806. Each line written would shimmer for a second, then dim, as if the book absorbed it not just as data, but as offering. It didn't just hold information, it held permission. What the ledger recorded, each entry was simple. Name of the child, date of overriding, voice origin, when known, symptoms, containment, status, notes on replication. But the horror lived in the margins. That's where the keeper would jot cryptic patterns, strange repetitions in speech, moments when one child mirrored another word for word. Despite having never met, patterns began to emerge. Every seventh child overwritten between 1780 to 1812 had the same dream, a well filled with teeth. 5 children drew identical maps, none matching real geography, but when overlaid, they formed the sigil of St. Langelus, a figure banned by both Vatican and Freemason archives. One child whispered coordinates, and months later, an earthquake struck precisely there. The echoes weren't just sharing memories, they were communicating across time, possibly across flesh. The forbidden 13th page, the first 12 pages document 71 children. But the 13th? It isn't a page, it's a mirrored, a polished black surface bound between vellum. Looking into it does not show your face, it shows the child nearest to becoming overwritten, no matter where in the world they are, no matter who they are. Even now, even today, several who glimpsed the 13th page went blind within days. Others simply disappeared. One researcher, in 1987, opened it under strict protocols, surrounded by Catholic, Jewish, and Muslim spiritual advisors. That he looked in and wept. His final words before a stroke rendered him catatonic. She's not lost. She's being recorded. Where the ledger is now, rumors say the hollow ledger was stolen in 1923 by a man named Ephraim Vale, an archivist for Yale's Skull and Bones Society. He died 6 days later from total organ failure. No sign of poison, no infection, just shut down. His replacement locked the book behind 3 vaults beneath a Masonic lodge in New Hampshire. But in 1983, during a routine inventory, it was gone. To no forced entry, no sign of break-in. Just an empty pedestal, and a single line carved into the floor. The voices walk now. Some believe the ledger moves by its own will. Others say it's passed from family to family, whispering the next name to fall, always one generation ahead. A few say it's been digitized, scanned, encrypted, waiting to be found on the dark net under names no man should type. But here's the real question. If the hollow ledger records those who are overwritten, and if it mirrors those soon to be taken, who's watching? The watchers? Because even the keeper eventually goes quiet, and the book, it never closes itself. It waits. There are places beneath the earth that were never dug, mined, or built. They were bled into existence. The Red Hollow was one such place, buried 4 levels below the Silence Vault, beneath layers of stone that weren't native to Virginia or anywhere else on Earth. It was only discovered because a 7-year-old orphan named Liddy started humming a melody no human had ever heard. When she did, a brick wall in the basement cracked open, as if summoned. The staff assumed it was just another hidden room. They were wrong. They didn't find a room. They found a womb, flesh that echoes, walls that breathe. The walls of the Red Hollow aren't stone. They're organic, pliable, warm to the touch, veined, and faintly pulsing like the inside of a throat. The air was wet, the silence not empty, but coiled, pregnant with something trying not to be born, yet not willing to remain unformed. The early reports from the first Hollingsworth descendants to descend into the Red Hollow used words like Slick with memory resonating with bone song disobedient to geometry, they realized quickly this wasn't a basement. This was a cavity of the overriding itself, not where children were brought, but where they were created, the throatless choir. They were never seen, only heard it first. When the red hollow was first breached, a low vibrating tone began to fill the air, identical to the hum Liddy had produced, and then came the voices, not from mouths, but from pore, wall, root, and pulse. It was a choir without origin, voicing songs in a language older than any known tongue, older even than Sumerian or Phoenician, something precausal, where sound doesn't describe reality but commands it. The children who heard the songs would enter a trance, and when they awoke, their tongues were gone, not removed, not injured, simply replaced with something else. They could still speak, but their voices were not their own, not copies, not mimicry, but echoes that moved forward in time, from a source still forming. The throatless choir was not a group of beings. It was a process, an infection of music that builds a body around itself, using children as scaffolding. The ritual of revoicing. By 1802, the Hollingsworth family began documenting a ritual known as revoicing, performed when a child was deemed fully overwritten. They would be taken into the Red Hollow, bound in silence. That a member of the family, often a matriarch or she who listens, would place her hands on the child's chest, and then she would begin humming, matching the exact frequency of the child's overriding echo. This was not a healing. This was a handover, because the moment the two voices harmonized perfectly, the matriarch would fall silent, and the child would begin speaking with her voice, not just in sound, but in thought. In memory. In identity. Each time this happened, one echo grew stronger. It began calling itself Ethelia. By 1814, 31 children bore that name internally. One voice, across many mouths, and every time it spoke, it whispered one phrase: "We are remembering ourselves into being." The silence that ended the hollow on August 9th, 1821, the red hollow stopped singing. The walls went still, the pulse went cold. One final child, named Ira, walked in and never came out, except 3 days later, 12 other children began drawing pictures of Ira, but the faces didn't match. In each drawing, Ira looked like one of them. If he'd become multiple. If the hollow hadn't consumed him, but used him to seed itself outward. The choir no longer needed the hollow. It had left the wound and entered the world. In frequencies. In melodies. In orphan lullabies no one remembered teaching. It was supposed to be contained. The Hollingsworths believed that as long as the red hollow remained sealed, as long as no child entered the chamber of the throatless choir, and as long as the ledger remained closed, the phenomenon would stay within the blood. But the echoes were never tied to biology. They were tied to resonance. And once the choir learned to seed itself into sound, it no longer needed a name, a womb, or a family to continue. It only needed an audience. The first unrelated case in 1835. A child named Malcolm Fielding was born in upstate New York. His family had no known connection to the Hollingsworth line, no intermarriages, no legal ties, no history of institutional care. At age 5, Malcolm began speaking in a voice not his own, a woman's voice. He'd speak about places no one in his family had ever been, recite names that didn't exist in local records, and draw complex architectural diagrams of underground structures. When his drawings were analyzed in 1952 by researchers at Miskatonic's Fringe Anthropology Department, they found something that defied belief. Malcolm's designs mirrored the red hollow almost perfectly, down to the number of vein segments in the organic walls. But he'd never been there, never even left his county. That's when it became clear the overriding had jumped the bloodline. Sympathetic frequency investigators from a hidden division within the Library of Congress, known only by the glyph, began mapping these occurrences. They found over 67 documented cases between 1830 and 1890 of children from entirely unrelated families showing signs of resonance. In every case, the onset of symptoms came after exposure to specific sounds, a lullaby hummed by a caregiver who couldn't recall learning it, the tolling of a bell rung during a forgotten town ritual, the strange warble of an out-of-tune piano in a burned-out orphanage. They discovered a frequency range between 17 to 19 Hz, just below the threshold of human hearing, embedded in each of these sounds. It was called the womb note. You couldn't hear it, but your body could feel it. Some researchers theorized the womb note acted as a carrier signal, allowing the choir to embed identity packets within harmonics. Others believed it was a summoning tone, a kind of key that opened a chamber inside the listener's perception, allowing the echo to rebuild itself. The horrifying truth? Most people who hear the womb note never realize it, but they change, slowly. Their handwriting alters, their preferences invert, their dreams begin to sync with others, and eventually, they speak words not found in any language and forget speaking them at all. The disappearance of individuality. By 1899, a disturbing shift began to emerge. Some affected individuals didn't just speak in new voices. They stopped responding to their own names. In one case, 12 children across 3 states were institutionalized for mass personality identity disruption. Upon separate evaluation, they all responded to a shared name, Lyria. When shown images of one another, they wept, not because they were confused, but because they recognized themselves in each other's eyes, not metaphorically, literally. MRI scans, conducted decades later using preserved remains, revealed identical neural patterns in the hippocampus and frontal cortex, as if they were not individuals, but distributed copies of the same root identity. This isn't mimicry, it's identity colonization. A system where the self is overwritten by a voice older than thought itself. The collapse of containment in 1912, the final attempt to contain the choir, was launched under the codename Project Stilwell, a collaborative effort between breakaway factions of the Vatican, the Smithsonian, and certain Masonic orders. They built a device called the anechoic casket, a tomb designed to erase all resonance from a 12-meter radius, theoretically silencing any echo contained within. A child named Evelyn was selected, an overwritten carrier fluent in 3 dead languages despite no formal education. She was placed inside. The casket was sealed, and for 3 minutes, the silence held. Then a single note cracked through the steel walls. Low, tender, unforgivable. The casket melted from the inside out. No heat, no chemical reaction. Just reversion. The materials fell apart at the molecular level, as if undone by the very concept of sound being erased. Evelyn was never found. But days later, a man in Turkey awoke speaking her last words. In perfect English. His family swore he'd never even learned to read. The choir's goal? Rememory. They aren't trying to destroy the world, they're trying to rewrite it. The choir believes existence is a flawed echo of a purer original voice, something lost during the first utterance of creation. Their aim? To realign every consciousness to that original note. Overwrite individual memory with unified resonance. Remove difference, doubt, hesitation, not for peace, but for control, because when every mind sings the same song, no one can disobey the melody. By the early 20th century, it became clear this wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't confined to ancient bloodlines, sealed hollows, or disused asylum wings. It had become infrastructural. The choir had found something more powerful than blood. Bureaucracy, curriculum, doctrine, policy. They didn't need to whisper into children's ears anymore. They could speak through textbooks, sermons, curriculums, and national rituals, and no one would know the voice wasn't human. The choir goes to church. In 1927, the Vatican's Department of Obscured Sin, a secretive archival body erased from public records in 1961, released a now-lost dossier titled Cantus Dei, The False Songs of Holiness. Its contents were damning. It accused at least 11 monasteries and 5 major orders of echoic contamination. Not heresy, not apostasy, contamination. Choir phrases were reportedly discovered embedded within sacred chants. Not Latin, not Aramaic, something else. Something that shifted phonetically depending on who heard it. The Vatican's own choir director at the time, Father Luco Moran, testified that during rehearsal, he began hearing dissonant harmonies emerging from no mouths. When he isolated the tapes, those harmonies carried speech, but only when played backwards and sped to 3x tempo. What did they say? We are not God, but we are before Him. Educational echoes. The curriculum that forgets you by 1943, public. Education reform in the U.S. began aligning under a centralized model. On the surface, it was about standardizing literacy and national unity, but buried within archived drafts of early federal education acts are handwritten marginalia, not from any known author, typed in ink, not matched to any manufacturer's record. Those notes reference something called the blanketing objective. According to these annotations, the goal wasn't knowledge. It was displacement. Early primers began subtly altering language patterns, reducing emotional range in children's stories, and restructuring sentence rhythm to weaken self-reference. Examples: I see the dog run became we watch the animal move. This is my book became the object is for use. Individual ownership faded. First-person reference discouraged. Emotionally vivid verbs replaced with flat descriptions. A generation raised on this would be linguistically softened, primed for overwrite, not with data, but with identity. Governmental absorption. The choir in civil policy in 1952, under the guise of Cold War anti-communism. A secret program was greenlit in the United States, Project Overtone. It had no budget on public record, no congressional oversight, no whistleblower ever survived. Its objective? Infrasonic governance by embedding subliminal harmonics in national broadcasts, both radio and TV. The state sought to test whether mass behavioral shifts could be triggered. The experiments were based on choir logic. If you shift the resonance, the behavior will follow. In a declassified recording from 1956, a test subject was exposed to 5 hours of layered patriotic programming, each minute subtly infused with a womb note variant. Result: subject lost all prior political opinions, referred to himself as we, began humming lullabies unknown to his family, died of spontaneous aneurysm after uttering. The chamber opens where consent is complete. His body was cremated before autopsy. The official cause: dissociative psychotic breakdown. Academic mimicry. The institutions that knew and copied by the 1960s, elite universities were no longer trying to stop the choir. They were trying to replicate it. Harvard's Department of Cognitive Engineering, now dissolved, began publishing mirror language theses, documents that reversed conventional structure, placing conclusions before premises, and using altered pronouns, I, we, /it, interchangeably. One leaked paper titled Ecocentric Consciousness in the Post-Self Era argued, the illusion of separate identity must be broken to allow for transpersonal convergence. Resonant minds are more compliant. Instruction should therefore include dissonant stress, followed by harmonious release. This matched exactly the mental conditioning structure observed in choir-overwritten children. Trauma, confusion, then coalescence into the other. Was academia still studying the infection, or had it joined it? Echoed leaders. When politicians began to hum in 1974, 3 world leaders were recorded subconsciously humming the same 6-note progression during unrelated press events. President Ford during an agriculture speech. French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing at a mining expo. Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi before entering a monastery. Analysts slowed the recordings and filtered frequencies. All 3 were humming what appeared to be the root phrase of the throatless choir. It wasn't random. It was ritual. A signal to the overwritten. We're in place now. Begin.